Hello and welcome to a Dominion 6 deep dive going over non-national blood battle magic. This is meant to be a follow-on to my previous quick tips on blood hunting, to give you a better idea of what you can use those blood slaves for on the battlefield. So the main benefit that blood magic has over other schools of magic is that in order to advance it, you really only need to research one research school, which is blood magic itself. This means that you can focus your research to get higher level spells faster without sacrificing buffing or damage spells like other schools. If you're purely considering using blood spells, then the only other school that you would really need to get is construction in order to help boost your blood mages and also to help you with your blood hunting. So let's have a little look through some of the battle spells. So as far as blood magic goes, it has the highest variety out of all of the schools for what you get at each level, and what you want to cast generally relies on your ability to get cross paths, but you can still do quite a bit with just pure blood. Do note that most combat spells do require a blood sacrifice in order to cast, so do make sure that you've allocated some people some blood slaves. Mages can also use blood slaves nearby them, not just the ones in their inventory, so sometimes clumping up your blood mages together can assist them in using slaves. Additionally, spells needing blood sacrifices cannot be cast underwater, as your blood slaves will drown. So, first thing I want to talk about here is the Sabbath Master and the Sabbath Slave spells. So these are your bread and butter for blood magic. These let your weaker blood mages reduce the fatigue they take for casting lower level spells by becoming masters, while you have the blood slaves with lots of reinvigoration tanking up the fatigue cost. They're not necessary if you're not sure how to do communions, but they will increase the power of your mages pretty well. You can also use reinvigoration, both in Sabbaths and without, in order to remove fatigue, and if the caster is in a Sabbath, it will also remove the fatigue from all slaves in the Sabbath as well. Which is really good because across the board, blood magic has some fairly high fatigue cost whenever you're using a spell in battle. I can't go forward now without talking about Summon Imps. It's a blood 1 spell that summons 5 Imps. Any blood mage can cast this, so you can swarm your enemy with not so great Imps. It's not the most efficient spell in battle, but you do get this at research level 2 in blood magic, and any blood mage can cast it. So it can be pretty good for early wars if your enemy isn't prepared for flyers. Combine this with lifelong protections for Impageddon. So I've set up a quick little battle here just to demonstrate the Impageddon. It's not that many bishops, there's only 3 of them. Each of them have a lifelong protection on them, and they're just scripted in order to cast Summon Imps, Rejuvenate, Summon Imps, Rejuvenate, and then Summon Imps again. You probably want to have Rejuvenate on your last script if you can for blood mages, just so they don't fatigue out, but this will do fine. And as we can see, if we just speed up, just with the amount of imps that are being summoned, they can actually just expand into this territory with not that much being used in terms of resources, just a couple of blood slaves, really. I mean, it's a fair amount, it's like 15 blood slaves, but you know, it's funny that you can do it. Moving on to more serious spells, so Bloodburst is an interesting spell. It's a high fatigue, armor negating damage spell with an AoE of 1 that cannot be resisted. So it's good against sacreds or units with high magic resistance and armor. It is, however, quite hard to spam due to the fatigue cost. You really want to make sure you're casting this with higher level blood mages or those in a Sabbath. And you want to make sure that you're using this when you need to, rather than just spamming this out all the time, because you will absolutely ruin your slaves and more than likely kill them. Additionally, at level 1, you get an interesting spell in Blood Boil. Now this is a blood and fire cross path. However, it does not require any blood slaves in order to cast, but you can still use them to reduce the fatigue cost, which makes it quite interesting. This is an armor negating, but magic resistance negates fire and magic damage, so it can be kind of useful in order to just do some damage to one person, maybe a bit of a thug, but its range is quite low, so don't rely on it. It's just a nice spell that your fire blood cross paths can have. At level 2, you get a much more interesting spell in Agony. So Agony is a blood 2 spell that causes 1 damage and an AoE of 4+, which is increased obviously with every extra level that your caster has, and increased by 2 on top of that. It also applies a major fear, and it also applies major fear in the area that it was cast on, Fear 3. This is a great spell to terror rout enemy units, not only able to apply fear, but also potentially get them to do a squad morale check due to everybody being slightly wounded with the 1 damage. You get this at blood level 2, and it's a good spell for the whole game, unless you're fighting undead or berserking units, especially when you join it with some later spells that we'll cover here in a moment. Now at level 3 you get access to Pain Transfer. I don't really rate this spell that much. It basically means that any damage that's done to your mage will instead be done to the slaves. They'll take half the damage that was inflicted on them. It does mean that your bigger casters or your more valuable casters are a little bit protected, but it does mean that you'll run out of blood slaves a lot quicker than you otherwise would, so be careful on that. You can cast this with Sabbaths so that if any of your slaves are starting to take fatigue damage, they then will damage slaves around them, which can be a way of mitigating some of the fatigue damage, but it's usually best just not to get to that fatigue level. Moving on to level 4, we have Bloodlust. So Bloodlust is an interesting one, so it's an army-wide buff for all friendly demons, and it gives them increased strength for the battle. This can be quite useful because the demons do a fair amount of damage already, and quite a few of them have more than one attack, so it can make them able to chew through chaff just a little bit better. Especially useful if you've got a lot of imps or other things that are coming out as well. Hellfire does need a level 2 crosspath in fire, but it's based on blood, so you can use blood slaves to boost yourself up through it. And it summons clouds of fire onto the battlefield, which is good against nature nations using bark skin or anybody else without fire resistance. Also with that, it's armor piercing, so it can be pretty good against some factions with high protection. Now, coming down a little bit more, we've got Hellbind Heart at level 5. So what that does, it lets you charm an enemy into your service. It is magic resistance negates, so it might not always work, and it does have quite a short range. But it can be good against thugs that haven't got the highest magic resistance in order to bring them on side, in order so that you can get used to them, and you obviously get any items that they come with. It's less useful in a major battle due to the number of potential targets, but it can also be good to mess up enemy formations. To summon Illearth gives you a regenning Earth Elemental, which is quite effective, but you do need an Earth 2 crosspath. However, given that Earth Elementals are a bit stronger, having one that also regenerates can be quite useful, and can usually tip some mid-game battles in your favour if you bring them in enough quantities. Bloodletting is another interesting spell. It's quite hard to cast because you require blood level 4, and it requires 4 slaves to cast. You're going to need to either empower your blood mages, or give them boosters in order to cast this. It's interesting the fact that it deals only 1 damage, but it hits the entire battlefield, and that includes friendly units, so every single unit on the battlefield will be hit by this spell. It does armor negating damage, so protection will not help against it at all, but it is magic resistance negates, so people with high MR will be able to defend against this. The fact that it does a small amount of damage, though, is good for interrupting enemy mages casting due to the damage check, but this will also affect your mages too, so keep that in mind. Any damage done is added to the mage's life force. This can be really good combined with Agony to keep squad morale checks going on throughout the battlefield, and to stop the enemy from casting some of their big spells, if you're worried about, say, things like Gifts from Heaven. Unfortunately with Bloodletting, the casting time is 250%, so you're gonna need to be able to predict when you think the enemy will do that in their script. Now moving on to a blood spell that I really love, Blood Rain. So Blood Rain is a fantastic spell with your other morale manipulators, as it continuously reduces the enemy morale by up to -5. Use this so more of your enemies run away due to fear, so you don't have to fight as many of them. Use this with your Agony, and also use this with your Bloodletting in order to make sure that the whole enemy army is constantly under fear effects. Now, when it comes to the other spells at level 6, Harm is also an interesting one, in that it has a large area of effect, which does increase for every extra level the caster is, so your higher level blood magic users, or those in Sabbaths, will be able to affect quite a large area of the battlefield, and it has quite a good range. It is magic resistance negates, but it is armor negating, and it does do a decent amount of damage. More damage than, say, Bloodletting does, but obviously in a smaller AoE. Anybody affected by this will also permanently have the affliction Chest Wound as well, which is one of the best afflictions to give to enemy thugs or super combatants because it reduces their maximum HP. Okay, moving on to level 7. So in level 7 we get Leech. Now Leech is the primo anti-thug spell. It causes high damage, at admittedly a low range, in a small AoE which is armor negating. It only requires 1 blood slave and blood 1 to cast, which means that all of your blood hunters with a few blood slaves can actually try and counter thug raids from the enemy when this unlocked, while they're also collecting blood slaves. Don't underestimate this. Obviously it's quite a high level of research at level 7, but once you unlock this, all of your blood mages can do quite a lot of damage fairly easily. Also in level 7 you get access to Purify Blood. Now Purify Blood is an interesting one in that it does require a nature crosspath, but it gives your entire army poison resistance plus 10. This isn't as important as it was in previous Dominions, because Foul Vapors obviously isn't as good, but things like Serpent Fang arrows or any of the other things that increase the amount of poison damage that are doing, this really does help you against that. So if you're going up against a nation with a lot of nature magic, or anything that has inbuilt poison, like say Middle-Aged Machaca with their Hunter Spiders, or anything like that, this will help you a little bit. Obviously with Death Poison, your mileage may vary a little bit. Now at Research level 8, we get access to the big spells. First of all, we have Damage Reversal, so this means that anybody who damages your mage that's casted on, then is also damaged themselves. Now this will work for Sabbaths, so if a Sabbath Master casts this, all the slaves get this as well, which is great. It is, however, magic resistance negates, which means that it won't always work, but it's a good way of being able to say, right, I've got my blood slaves out in front, they're taking some damage, the enemy mages will be taking damage in return, as long as they fail the magic resistance check. Next on the list we have Rush of Strength. It does require blood level 3, but you could probably easily cast this with a Sabbath, and this gives all of your friendly units plus 4 strength across the entire battlefield. Doesn't actually cost that much fatigue, only 100, so if you're going to Sabbath, that's going to be spread out pretty well. And the fact that it gives so much strength to all of your units means they'll all be able to get through chaff so much easier, and probably even damage some giants. Do note as well, unlike Bloodlust, this affects everybody, not just demons, which is very, very good. This is where you also get Life for a Life, which is a fantastic damage spell, which is very useful against both thugs and super combatants, in that it does a lot of damage. It is harder to cast in that it does require the 3 blood, and it has a very, very high fatigue cost, so you're going to be churning through your blood slaves in order to try and reduce the amount of fatigue that you're taking, but it is a lot of damage, armor negating damage, on one target with 100 precision, so you're always going to hit. This is very useful against things like gods, thugs, or super combatants to really chunk them down. Finally, in order to get rid of super combatants, you have access to 2 other things depending on your cross paths: Infernal Prison and Claws of Kokytus. And what they will do is Infernal Prison will send somebody down into Inferno, into Hell, whereas Kokytus will send them down into Icy Hell. For both of these, there is no way of resisting this. If this is cast, it will happen. And if they are sent down to these planes, they will be gone from the mortal plane, the plane that we usually play on. And more likely than not, they will probably die, but there is a chance they will be able to find their way back. But it won't be for at least a couple of turns. So this is actually really good to use against super combatants or thugs, just because there's purely no way to resist this. So if your enemy's sending out a super combatant or is using their god just by himself, cast this, and they will not like you. As far as the level 9 ones go, there's no actual battle magic here, but some of these spells can be kind of useful for summoning to increase the number of forces that you have. With the changes to level 9 spells, though, you're going to struggle to research these until fairly late into the game, so do keep that in mind. Lastly but not least, there is also the ability to use what is known as a Hellbomb. Now that is centered around this spell, Hell Power. These involve using a bunch of level 1 blood mages to get into a Sabbath together, spread out all across the battlefield, with the caster then using Hell Power. This marks himself and all the slaves and gives a massive boost to their stats, while also starting to call horrors onto the battlefield. You can then additionally on top of that start calling lesser horrors or larger horrors onto the battlefield if you have the astral paths, which will mean that your enemy will not have a good time. These horrors will attack both yourself and the enemy at random, though they will be drawn to your casters because of the horror marks. This can be a cost-effective and devastating way to destroy a large enemy force if they're not ready for it, though you will lose some blood mages in the process, so try and use it on some that aren't that important. You also need to kind of be able to judge it so that you have the critical mass of blood mages that you're effectively throwing away in order to defeat the enemy army. This is not something you want to do normally. This is more if you're losing a war and you're wanting to throw a Hail Mary to try and stop a Doomstack that's bearing down your capital. This is what I would suggest. Just be prepared to lose everybody in your hell bombing force as it goes in. Alright, so that's a brief overview about the blood spells that you can use in battle. I'm going to do another video separate to this to go over the forging options and probably some of the rituals you can do out of blood magic in order to support your forces and summon even more demons for your armies. So, until next time, take care.